Charles stood before the crystalline throne, hands bound behind his back, watching Empress Varen's 4 eyes blaze with fury. The vast court hall had fallen silent. Every dignitary, advisor, and guard witnessed his disgrace. "You dare question my judgment?" Varen's voice echoed through the chamber, her serpentine body coiling tighter on her throne. "You, a human, a representative of a barely spacefaring species, presume to know better than I." "Your Majesty, I only suggested." Silence. Her crest flared purple with rage. 3 cycles I have tolerated your presence here. 3 cycles of your strange customs and presumptuous counsel. No more. Charles felt his heart sink. He had merely proposed a trade adjustment that would benefit the outer colonies. He hadn't meant to contradict her publicly. "For your insolence, I banish you from the Viridian Empire. You will be escorted to the border worlds and released. If you ever set foot in Imperial space again, you will be executed immediately." The guards grabbed his arms. Charles looked up one last time, meeting Varen's gaze. For a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, hesitation, perhaps regret. But then her expression hardened. "Remove him from my sight." As they dragged him away, Charles couldn't know that his exile would set in motion events that would shake the entire empire to its foundation. 2 months earlier, Charles had arrived at the imperial capital aboard a human diplomatic vessel. Earth's representatives had worked decades to secure this opportunity. A single human advisor granted access to the Viridian court. The Viridian Empire controlled 200 star systems. Their technology surpassed humanity's by centuries. Their military could crush Earth's defenses in days. But they valued knowledge from all sources, collecting advisors from dozens of species. Charles had been chosen for his skills in economics and conflict resolution. At 32, he was young by diplomatic standards, but his work mediating the Mars Belt disputes had earned him recognition. The capital city of Throne-above World sprawled across an artificial construct the size of Earth's moon. Towers of living crystal reached into space. Ships moved like schools of fish through designated airways. The population numbered in the billions. Varen herself had greeted him at his first audience. Her species, the Selenari, resembled great serpents with 4 manipulator arms and compound eyes that saw in spectrums humans couldn't perceive. She was ancient by human standards, having ruled for over a century. "Welcome, human Charles," she had said, her translator rendering her hissing speech into perfect English. "I am curious what perspective your kind might offer. Your species is young, but youth sometimes sees what age overlooks." He had bowed deeply, hopeful for the opportunity to prove humanity's worth. Charles quickly learned the complex dynamics of Varen's court. The empire wasn't monolithic, it was a careful balance of species, factions, and competing interests. The Broken Circle, Varen's Council of 12, represented the empire's major regions and species. Each counselor commanded enormous influence. Each had their own agenda. There was Morven, a hulking Taurati whose crystalline carapace reflected light in hypnotic patterns. He controlled the military districts and viewed humans as insignificant primitives. Beside him sat Yissa, a floating Quellan whose gaseous form swirled in a containment suit. She managed the Empire's vast trade networks and had shown Charles unexpected kindness. The others ranged from the spider-like architect Ren to the collective intelligence known as the Assembly, which spoke through a designated bioform. Charles's role was to observe, learn, and offer suggestions when appropriate. For the first 2 months, he mostly stayed silent, absorbing the intricacies of imperial politics. He watched as Varen mediated disputes with wisdom earned over decades. He saw how she balanced military strength with diplomatic finesse. The empire remained stable because she held all factions in careful equilibrium. But Charles also noticed troubling patterns. The outer colonies paid heavy tributes while receiving little support. Pirates raided shipping lanes with impunity. Complaints from frontier worlds went unanswered. These observations would eventually lead to his downfall. The moment came during a council session discussing tax revenues. Morven was demanding increased tribute from the Outer Reach colonies to fund fleet expansion. These worlds benefit from imperial protection, he rumbled. They should pay accordingly. Charles reviewed the data on his tablet. The numbers didn't add up. The Outer Reach colonies already contributed 40% of their GDP. Increasing that would cripple their economies. He caught Yissa's attention and whispered his observation. She rippled with what might have been surprise. The human has noticed something, she announced to the council. Charles, share your analysis. All eyes turned to him. Charles felt his throat go dry, but he stood. Honored counselors, Empress Banished, I believe increasing Outer Reach tributes would be counterproductive. These colonies already contribute significantly more, per capita, than core worlds. Further taxation might drive them to desperation. Morven's carapace flashed angry red. These primitives breed instability with their concerns about fairness. But Varen raised a hand for silence. Explain, Charles. He presented his data, showing how the Outer Reach economies balanced precariously. Instead of increasing taxes, he suggested reducing them slightly while offering better trade terms. Prosperous colonies would ultimately contribute more. Varen studied the numbers for a long moment. The human makes a valid point. We will implement a modified version of his suggestion. Morven said nothing, but his silence promised consequences. Over the following weeks, Charles's influence grew. Varen began asking for his input regularly. His fresh perspective revealed solutions others had missed. He proposed modifications to patrol routes that reduced piracy. He suggested cultural exchange programs that eased tensions between species. His ideas worked. But with success came resentment. Morven saw him as a threat to military expansion. Other counselors disliked that an outsider, especially from such a young species, held the Empress's ear. They began to work against him subtly. His suggestions were criticized before being heard. His data was questioned. Rumors spread that he held undue influence over Varen, that he manipulated her. Charles tried to navigate these politics carefully. He deferred to senior counselors when possible. He worked to build alliances. But he was human, alone, and didn't fully understand the intricate web of imperial court dynamics. Yissa warned him one day, her gases swirling urgently. Charles, you make powerful enemies. Morven gathers allies against you. Be cautious. I'm only trying to help, Charles protested. That may be precisely the problem, she replied. You threaten the established order. Those who benefit from the current system fear change. Charles should have heeded her warning more carefully. Instead, he continued offering honest counsel, believing truth and good intentions would be enough. He was about to learn how dangerously naive that belief was. The trap was sprung during a session about border security. The Keth Dominion, a rival power bordering imperial space, had been making aggressive moves. Several frontier outposts reported Keth ships testing defenses. Morven proposed a massive military buildup along the border. We must show strength. The Keth respect only power. Charles had studied the Keth situation. The aggressive posturing seemed reactive, triggered by recent Imperial fleet exercises near their space. Both sides were escalating unnecessarily. Before he could stop himself, he spoke. Perhaps military buildup isn't the answer. The Keth appear to be responding to our own exercises. If we open diplomatic channels instead. You suggest we show weakness? Morven's voice thundered through the chamber. Not weakness, restraint. Human history shows that arms races often lead to conflicts neither side wants. If we... Human history. Morven laughed harshly. Your species has existed in space for mere decades. The Keth have been our enemies for centuries. You know nothing of this situation. Charles persisted, his passion overriding his judgment. That's exactly why my perspective has value. Sometimes those closest to a problem can't see solutions. An outside view. Enough. Varen's voice cut through the argument. Her crest had flushed an ominous purple. Charles fell silent, suddenly realizing he'd gone too far. He'd contradicted the Empress directly, in open court, on a matter of imperial security. The chamber had gone deathly quiet. Varen rose from her throne, her massive serpentine form uncoiling to its full imposing height. Charles felt very small. You overstep, human. I have tolerated your suggestions in economic matters, but military strategy requires understanding you do not possess. The Keth are not some human tribal conflict to be resolved with handshakes and trade agreements. Your Majesty, I didn't mean. You presume too much. Her voice had turned cold. I granted you access to this court as a courtesy to your species. You were to observe and offer minor insights, not dictate policy on matters of imperial survival. Charles felt blood rushing to his face. Every eye in the massive chamber watched his humiliation. This is what comes of showing favor to primitives, Morven interjected smoothly. The human has forgotten his place. Perhaps it is time he returned to his own kind. Varen's eyes, all four of them, fixed on Charles with an expression he couldn't read. Disappointment? Anger? Something else? Not yet, she said finally. But Charles will confine his suggestions to matters befitting his limited experience. He will not speak on military or strategic issues again. Is this understood? Yes, Your Majesty, Charles managed, though the words tasted like ash. The session continued, but Charles barely heard it. He'd been put in his place, publicly diminished. Everything he'd built over 3 months had crumbled in moments. What he didn't know was that this humiliation was only the beginning. After the council session, Charles found himself increasingly isolated. Counselors who had previously acknowledged him now looked through him. Invitations to diplomatic functions stopped arriving. Even his quarters seemed colder, though that might have been his imagination. Only Yissa still spoke with him, visiting his chambers one evening. You made a grave error, she said without preamble. Challenging Varen publicly on military matters, especially involving the Keth, was foolish. I was trying to prevent an unnecessary conflict. Your intentions matter little. You showed disrespect. In Selenari culture, to question a leader's judgment publicly is to challenge their authority. Varen could not let such a challenge stand. Charles slumped in his chair. I didn't know. Human leaders expect to be challenged, to have their ideas tested. You are not among humans, Yissa reminded him gently. And there is more. Morven has been spreading poison about you. He claims you seek to weaken the Empire, that Earth sent you to make Varen doubt herself before some human expansion plan. That's absurd. Earth has no ability to threaten the Empire. Truth matters less than perception. Morven is skilled at politics. He has turned your honest mistakes into evidence of malice. Charles felt the walls closing in. What should I do? Be silent. Be humble. Perhaps in time, this will pass. But Yissa's swirling gases suggested she doubted her own words. That night, Charles couldn't sleep. He'd come to help, to prove humanity's worth, and instead had become a liability. 3 days later, Charles was summoned to an emergency council session. Keth ships had crossed into Imperial space, destroying an outpost in the Rim sectors. 1,700 souls lost. Varen's fury was cold and terrible. We will respond with overwhelming force. Morven, prepare the 3rd and 5th fleets for immediate deployment. The council erupted in discussion. Charles listened to the tactical planning with growing alarm. The response being proposed would kill thousands and likely trigger a full-scale war. He tried to remain silent, remembering Yissa's warning. But as he studied the incident reports, something caught his attention. The destroyed outpost had been a scientific station, lightly defended, in a disputed border region. The Keth ships had jumped in, fired, and immediately retreated. It didn't match Keth military doctrine. They were aggressive but strategic. This attack seemed designed to provoke exactly the response Varen was planning. Charles's conscience warred with his survival instinct. If he stayed silent and this escalated into war, millions might die. But if he spoke up again, after being warned. He stood. "Your Majesty, I request permission to speak." The chamber fell silent. Varen's eyes fixed on him with something like disbelief. "You were instructed not to involve yourself in military matters." "I know, and I apologize, but I believe this attack is a provocation. The target choice, the tactics, someone wants us to escalate. If we could investigate before responding." "Enough." Varen's roar shook the chamber. "Your arrogance knows no bounds, human. 1,700 of my subjects are dead, and you dare suggest restraint? You dare question my judgment again? I'm trying to help. You are trying my patience beyond all limits." That was when Charles made his final mistake. Desperate, passionate, he spoke words he would regret. "Then perhaps your patience has limits because you know I'm right." The silence that followed was absolute. Varen descended from her throne slowly, deliberately. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, which somehow made it more terrifying. "You have insulted me, questioned me, and now accused me of dishonesty before my entire court. I have shown you honor by welcoming you. I have shown you patience when you overstepped. But you repay me with disrespect and arrogance." Charles realized the magnitude of his error, but it was far too late. "I am sorry, Your Majesty. I spoke in haste. Your apology is meaningless. You are hereby banished from the Viridian Empire. You will be escorted to the border worlds and expelled. If you return, you will be executed. Take him." Guards seized Charles. As they dragged him from the chamber, he saw Yissa's form swirling in distress. Morven's carapace gleamed with satisfaction. And Varen, the Empress he'd tried so hard to help, turned away as if he'd never existed. Within hours, Charles was aboard a prison transport heading for the frontier. His diplomatic credentials were revoked. Earth's mission to the Empire lay in ruins. He'd been given one small mercy, exile rather than execution. It felt like no mercy at all. As the ship carried him away from Throne Above Worlds, Charles stared at the stars and wondered what he could possibly do now. He'd lost everything, his position, his purpose, his chance to make a difference. The irony was that his warning about the Keth attack had been correct. The incident was a provocation, the opening move in a much larger game. Charles would discover this truth soon enough, in the most unexpected way possible. The transport dumped Charles on Reach Station 7, a grim outpost on the Empire's edge. It was a place for exiles, smugglers, and those who'd fallen through society's cracks. With no resources and no way home, Earth was months away through non-imperial routes. Charles had to survive. He took work as a data analyst for a trading company, using his skills to optimize cargo routes. It was humble work, far from the imperial court, but it kept him fed. More importantly, it gave him access to information flowing through the frontier. Charles noticed disturbing patterns. Keth ships appeared with increasing frequency in disputed zones. Imperial patrol responses were slow, almost deliberately so. Trade ships went missing at alarming rates. Then came the refugees. Families from border colonies, fleeing something terrible. Charles interviewed them during his off hours. Their stories painted a horrifying picture. Colonies going silent. Relief ships finding empty settlements. And strange reports of a third party, neither Keth nor Imperial, operating in the shadows. He compiled his data obsessively, unable to break his old habits. A larger picture emerged: Someone was systematically destabilizing the frontier, attacking both Imperial and Keth targets to increase tensions. But who? And why? His answer came 2 months into his exile, in the form of a midnight raid on Reach Station 7. Charles woke to alarms and weapons fire. He rushed to his window and saw ships he didn't recognize, sleek, dark vessels with unfamiliar markings, docking with the station. Soldiers poured through the corridors, rounding up residents. Charles tried to flee but was cornered by 3 armed figures in black armor. "This one," the leader said, studying a holographic display. "He's the human from the Imperial Court. High value. Take him to the ship." They dragged Charles aboard one of the vessels. As it disengaged from the station, he saw Reach Station 7's lights flicker and die. They'd disabled it completely. Charles was brought to a detention cell where he found a dozen other prisoners, merchants, station administrators, even 2 Imperial officials. "Who are these people?" Charles asked a Torati merchant in the adjacent cell. "The Obsidian Fleet," the merchant replied grimly. "Pirates, warlords, exiles from a dozen nations. They've been growing in power for years, hiding in the dead zones between empires. What do they want? Everything. They plan to carve out their own domain from the chaos they're creating. The Keth Imperial tensions. That's their doing. They attack both sides, make it look like the other is responsible." Charles felt sick. He tried to warn Varen about this kind of manipulation, and she banished him for it. The ship traveled for days through uncharted space. Finally, they arrived at a hidden construct, a massive station built from scavenged technology, bristling with weapons. Charles was brought before the leader of the Obsidian Fleet. Fleet Commander Darius was human. Charles stared in shock at the man seated on the command throne. In his 50s, scarred and hardened, wearing armor that combined technology from multiple civilizations. "Surprised?" Darius asked in English, a harsh smile on his face. "Did you think you were the only human playing at galactic politics? You're attacking Imperial and Keth targets. Starting a war." "I'm creating an opportunity," Darius corrected. "The great empires have controlled space for too long. They treat younger species as servants or curiosities. It's time for a new order. An order with you in charge. Someone has to lead. Why not humans? We've proven ourselves resourceful, adaptive. You yourself were an advisor to the Empress, until she discarded you like waste." Charles's jaw tightened. "I made mistakes. You told her truths she didn't want to hear. I know about you, Charles. I've followed your career. The work you did on Mars, your insights at the Imperial Court, you're wasted as an exile." Darius stood, approaching the force field containing Charles. "Join us. You understand Imperial politics, their systems, their weaknesses. With your knowledge, we can strike decisive blows. We can carve out human-led territory from the chaos. Isn't that better than rotting on some frontier station?" Charles felt the temptation. He was angry at Varen, hurt by his banishment. Part of him wanted to prove she'd been wrong to dismiss him. But he looked at Darius and saw only ambition and ruthlessness. This wasn't about elevating humanity. It was about power. "No," Charles said. "I won't help you start a war." Darius's expression hardened. "Then you'll rot in a cell until you change your mind. We have time." Charles was confined to a small cell on the station. Days blurred into weeks. He was fed and kept healthy. Darius clearly hoped to break his will, but otherwise left alone with his thoughts. Through the cell's small window, he watched the Obsidian Fleet grow. More ships arrived daily. Weapons were stockpiled. Darius was preparing for something big. Charles's guard was a young Quellan named Tess, whose gaseous form swirled in shades of gray rather than Yissa's vibrant colors. "Why are you here?" Charles asked her one day. The Viridian Empire killed my family, Tess replied flatly. A patrol ship fired on our civilian transport. Called it a mistake. Paid compensation and forgot about us. I'm sorry. Darius offers revenge. Purpose. What did the Empire offer you? A chance to make things better. I thought I could help bridge the gap between humans and the older species. How did that work out? Charles had no answer. But as he talked with Tess over the following days, he began to understand the Obsidian Fleet's composition. They were exiles, victims, and the dispossessed. People who'd been hurt by the empires and saw Darius as their avenue to power or revenge. Some were truly malicious. But others, like Tess, were just desperate and angry. What is Darius planning? Charles asked finally. Tess was silent for a long moment. Then, he's going to attack the Keth homeworld. Make it look like an imperial assault. Start a full-scale war. In the chaos, the Obsidian Fleet will seize control of the frontier sectors. Charles felt cold. Millions would die. Charles knew he had to escape and warn someone, anyone. But his cell was secure, and he was one unarmed human on a station full of soldiers. He needed allies. He began talking to other prisoners during the brief periods they were allowed to socialize in a common area. There was Kelvin, an Imperial intelligence officer. Mira, a Keth ambassador who'd been captured during a raid. Oren, a Torati engineer. And others, a dozen beings from various species and factions. We've all tried to escape, Kelvin told Charles quietly. The station's security is too tight. But what if we didn't try to escape? Charles proposed. What if we sabotaged the attack instead? That got their attention. Charles laid out a plan. Oren could access the station's engineering systems through maintenance panels in their detention area. Mira knew Keth military codes and could send a warning if they could reach communications. Kelvin had Imperial security overrides. Together, they could disable enough of the fleet's systems to delay the attack and send warnings to both empires. Even if we succeed, we'll likely die, Mira pointed out. Darius will execute us. If we don't try, millions die, Charles countered. I've made a lot of mistakes. I'm trying to do one thing right. One by one, they agreed. Even knowing the cost, they would act. Over the next week, they prepared. Oren slowly worked on the maintenance panel. Charles mapped guard rotations. Kelvin identified critical systems. Then came the day Darius announced the fleet would launch in 24 hours. It was time. The escape began during a shift change when guard coverage was thinnest. Oren bypassed the cell locks, and the prisoners moved swiftly through the detention area. Kelvin's security overrides got them into a maintenance shaft. They split into teams. Oren and his group headed for the main reactor controls. Mira and hers went for communications. Charles and Kelvin made for the command center. Darius had intelligence there that might prove the Obsidian Fleet's responsibility for the attacks. They moved through the station's guts, avoiding patrols. Alarms hadn't been raised yet, but Charles knew it was only a matter of time. Oren reached the reactors first. He input the codes that would create a controlled power fluctuation, not enough to destroy the station, but enough to disable the fleet's jump drives for hours. The lights flickered. Alarms began to wail. Go! Charles shouted to his team. They ran for the command center. Myra's team fought their way to communications. She broadcast on all frequencies, revealing the Obsidian Fleet's location and Darius's plans. The message wouldn't reach the empires for hours, but it was out there, impossible to recall. Charles and Kelvin burst into the command center to find Darius waiting for them, armed guards at his side. Did you really think I didn't know? Darius asked coldly. I've been watching you plot for days. Your guard, Tess, reported everything. Charles felt betrayed, but he didn't let it show. Then you know your plan is over. The message is sent. Both empires will come for you. They'll come too late, Darius said. We'll launch anyway, even without jump drives. We'll use slower routes. Your sabotage bought them hours, not victory. He raised his weapon toward Charles. Then the wall exploded. Through the breach came a squad of soldiers in Imperial armor. At their head was someone Charles never expected to see again, Yissa, her gaseous form swirling with determined energy. Stand down, Darius, she commanded. The Obsidian Fleet guards opened fire. A chaotic battle erupted in the command center. Charles dove for cover behind a console. Kelvin tackled Darius, wrestling for his weapon. Imperial soldiers exchanged fire with Darius's forces. Yissa reached Charles, her containment suit crackling with energy shield activations. We received strange intelligence about this location. I convinced a strike team to investigate. Are you injured? I'm fine. How did you know I was here? I didn't. But I knew something was wrong. When we detected that broadcast, we moved immediately. The battle was brief but fierce. Imperial soldiers were better trained. Within minutes, they'd secured the command center. Kelvin had Darius pinned, the warlord's weapon skittering across the floor. But as Charles stood, relieved, Darius laughed bitterly. You've stopped nothing. My fleet will scatter. We'll rebuild. And I've already won the real victory. What do you mean? Yissa demanded. 3 hours ago, before your arrival, I sent my fastest ships toward Keth space. They'll attack Imperial border stations. The Keth will retaliate. War is already inevitable. Charles felt his heart sink. They'd come so close. Unless, he said slowly, unless both sides are warned. Unless someone they trust can explain what really happened. Yissa's gases swirled. Varen would never listen to you. You're banished on pain of death. Charles met her eyes. Then I guess I'd better be convincing. The Imperial ship carrying Charles back to Throne Above Worlds moved at maximum speed. Every minute mattered. Darius's attack ships had a head start. Yissa had convinced the strike team commander to bring Charles along, but it had taken all her influence. As an exile, he was supposed to be executed on sight. When we arrive, you will be arrested immediately, Yissa warned. I can get you an audience with Varen, but I cannot guarantee she'll listen before ordering your execution. I know the risks. Charles spent the journey compiling evidence. Data from Darius's command center. Testimony from freed prisoners. Communication logs proving the Obsidian fleet had orchestrated attacks on both sides. But evidence alone might not be enough. He needed to reach Varen's heart, not just her mind. They arrived at Throne Above Worlds to find the capital on high alert. Reports of new attacks had already arrived. The military was preparing a massive strike against the Keth. Charles was seized the moment he disembarked. Guards bound him and prepared to drag him to execution. I demand an audience. Yissa declared, her gases blazing with authority. This human carries intelligence vital to Imperial security. Empress Varen must hear it before any sentence is carried out. The guards hesitated. A rapid consultation occurred. Finally, grudgingly, they agreed to bring Charles before the Empress. But they would do so in chains, and the executioner would wait nearby. As Charles was marched through the palace, he saw preparations for war everywhere. Soldiers mustering. Ships launching. The machinery of the Empire turning toward violence. He had one chance to stop it. Varen sat upon her crystalline throne, surrounded by the broken circle. Her eyes tracked Charles with cold fury as guards forced him to his knees before the court. You return despite my decree, she said, her voice promising death. Give me one reason I should not have you executed immediately. Charles met her gaze steadily. Because in 3 hours, ships flying false imperial colors will attack Keth border positions. The Keth will retaliate. Millions will die in a war that benefits neither empire. Morven's carapace flashed. More lies from the exile. Your Majesty, end this. Let him speak, Yissa interjected. I vouch for the truth of his discovery. Charles quickly explained everything, the Obsidian fleet, Darius's plan, the evidence he'd gathered. He laid out how the frontier attacks had been orchestrated to create the war Varen was now preparing to fight. I was right, he said finally. When I warned you that the attacks seemed designed to provoke escalation, I was right. You banished me for speaking that truth. Now that truth returns whether you want to hear it or not. The court erupted in argument. Counselors demanded his execution. Others called for his evidence to be examined. Varen silenced them all with a gesture. She descended from her throne, moving until she loomed over Charles. You dare lecture me? You, who showed such disrespect that I had no choice but to banish you. I showed you honesty, Charles said quietly. I came from a species you consider primitive, and I tried to offer what I could. I made mistakes in how I spoke, but never in what I said. And now I return not to gloat, but to beg you to prevent a catastrophe. Something in Varen's expression shifted. Why? Why risk execution to warn an empire that cast you out? Because millions of innocents will die if I don't. Because it's the right thing to do. And because despite everything, I still believe you're wise enough to see the truth when it's in front of you. Silence fell across the throne room. All eyes watched the Empress and the exile, locked in their moment of confrontation. Varen studied Charles for what felt like an eternity. Then she turned to her counselors. Morven. Verify this human's claims. Contact the Keth Dominion on secure channels. Share our intelligence. If they have received similar evidence of manipulation, we will know the exile speaks truly. Morven's carapace flushed with anger, but he couldn't refuse a direct order. He initiated communications. The minutes that followed were agonizing. Charles remained on his knees, guards ready to execute him at a word from Varen. Finally, a Keth representative appeared on the holographic display, a mantis-like being with compound eyes. Empress Varen, the Keth said carefully. We have just captured ships attacking our territory. They bore imperial markings but their crews were mixed species, many exiles and criminals. Our intelligence suggested a third party was manipulating our peoples toward war. As did ours, Varen replied. It appears we have both been deceived. The two leaders looked at each other across the gulf of centuries of mistrust. Then, remarkably, they began to talk. Charles watched as Varen and the Keth representative shared intelligence, compared notes, and realized the scope of the manipulation. More than pride was at stake now, both empires had been played for fools. Within the hour, they had forged an agreement. Joint forces would hunt down the remaining Obsidian fleet ships. Darius's captured commanders would be tried publicly. And both empires would establish a direct communication channel to prevent future manipulation. War had been averted. Varen turned back to Charles. You were right, exile. About the attacks, about the manipulation, about the need for restraint. Had I listened to you months ago, much suffering could have been prevented. Your Majesty, I. However, she continued, you were also disrespectful, arrogant, and failed to understand the culture you operated within. Both things can be true. She coiled her massive form thoughtfully. What am I to do with you, human? Charles remained silent, waiting for Varen's judgment. The entire court watched. By law, you should be executed for violating your exile, Varen said. But by justice, you should be honored for preventing catastrophe. These two truths are in conflict. Morven spoke up. The law must be upheld, Your Majesty. To do otherwise shows weakness. And yet, Yissa countered, to ignore service rendered shows ingratitude. The human risked everything to save lives. Varen raised a hand for silence. Charles of Earth, approach. Charles stood and walked forward on unsteady legs. Varen's 4 eyes studied him with an expression he was beginning to read, not anger now, but something more complex. When you first came to my court, I welcomed you because I believed young species might see what old eyes miss. I was right. You saw problems we had grown blind to. But you also came with human arrogance, assuming your brief experience qualified you to challenge centuries of imperial governance. You were brilliant and foolish in equal measure. Charles nodded slowly. You're right. I saw problems, but I didn't understand the cultural context. I tried to help, but I disrespected traditions I should have honored. I'm sorry for that. And I, Varen said quietly, surprising everyone, allowed my pride to blind me. When you challenged me publicly, I felt humiliated before my court. I banished you not because you were wrong, but because you made me feel diminished. That was unworthy of me. She extended one of her manipulator arms. In her grasp was a crystal pendant, a symbol of imperial favor. I cannot simply reverse your banishment without undermining my own authority. But I can offer you a new position. You will serve as an independent arbiter, answering directly to me. You will investigate problems throughout the empire and report honestly, even when your findings are uncomfortable. You will show proper respect in how you deliver these truths. And I will listen with proper humility. We will both do better. Do you accept? Charles took the crystal pendant with trembling hands. Yes, Your Majesty. I accept. The court erupted in whispers. Morven looked furious. Yissa swirled with what might have been joy. The days following Charles's reinstatement passed in a blur of activity. The alliance with the Keth Dominion held, fragile but functional. Joint task forces hunted down the Obsidian Fleet's remnants. Darius himself was brought to Throne Above Worlds for trial. Charles attended, watching the man who tried to manipulate him face justice. You could have been great, Darius said during a brief moment when they were alone. Instead, you chose to serve the same empire that threw you away. I chose to serve something larger than my own ego, Charles replied. That's the difference between us. Darius was sentenced to life imprisonment. The Obsidian Fleet soldiers faced varied punishments depending on their crimes. Some, like Tess, were offered rehabilitation. Their grievances against the empires had been real, even if their methods were wrong. Charles threw himself into his new role. His first investigation addressed the very problem that had led to his initial conflict with Varen, the treatment of outer colonies. He traveled to frontier worlds, listening to complaints and gathering evidence. His report was thorough and unflinching, documenting systematic neglect and exploitation. When he presented it to the Broken Circle, he did so respectfully but firmly. These colonies are part of the Empire. They deserve better than they've received. Not because I say so, but because the Empire's own principles demand it. Morven argued against reforms, but this time he stood alone. The near war had shaken the council. Varen herself supported Charles's recommendations. Implement these changes, she decreed. The Empire will be stronger for listening to all its people, not just those at the center. Charles felt something he hadn't experienced since his banishment, hoped that he could actually make a difference. 6 months after his return, Charles stood in a newly constructed facility on the border between Imperial and Keth space, the Institute for Interspecies Understanding. The Institute was his proposal, supported jointly by Varen and the Keth Dominion. A place where different species could learn about each other, where diplomats could train, where conflicts could be mediated before they became wars. Yissa had agreed to serve as co-director alongside Charles. Together, they watched the first class of students arrive, young beings from a dozen species, including several humans from Earth. You've come far from the exile sleeping in a cell on Reach Station 7, Yissa observed. We've all come far, Charles replied. 6 months ago, the Empire and the Keth were hours from war. Now we're teaching our children to understand each other. Don't let it go to your head, Yissa warned, but her swirling color suggested she was pleased. The work was challenging. Old prejudices didn't disappear overnight. Morven and his faction still resisted many reforms. The Keth remained suspicious, and many in the Empire saw the alliance as temporary at best. But Charles had learned patience. He'd learned to navigate cultural differences with respect rather than arrogance. He'd learned that being right wasn't enough, how you presented truth mattered as much as truth itself. He'd also learned that he'd been wrong about many things. The Empire wasn't perfect, but neither was it the static, unchangeable monolith he'd once imagined. It could grow, could adapt, could become better. And he'd been spectacularly wrong about Varen. She wasn't the proud, inflexible autocrat he'd thought. She was a leader carrying the weight of billions, trying to balance competing interests while maintaining stability. His public challenges hadn't just been disrespectful, they'd made her job harder. Understanding that had changed everything. Charles's 1-year anniversary as Imperial Arbiter was marked by a formal ceremony. Varen herself attended, along with representatives from throughout the Empire and even Keth observers. When Charles of Earth first came to my court, Varen said in her address, I saw him as a curiosity. A representative of a young species, perhaps offering fresh perspectives. When he challenged me, I saw him as a threat to my authority. I banished him, believing I was maintaining order. When he returned at the head of my enemy's intelligence, I nearly had him executed. I'm grateful my counselors convinced me to listen first. She turned to Charles directly. You have shown me that wisdom comes not just from age, but from the courage to see clearly. You have also shown remarkable growth, learning to balance honesty with diplomacy. You came to us as a human trying to prove your species' worth. You became simply Charles, a person of integrity serving the greater good. That is the highest compliment I can offer. Charles bowed deeply, in the Selenari manner he'd finally learned properly. Your Majesty, I came here arrogant and naive. You taught me humility through harsh but necessary lessons. I hope to spend many years earning the trust you've placed in me. After the ceremony, Charles found himself approached by a young human woman, one of Earth's new diplomatic candidates. Sir, I've studied your work, she said excitedly. The way you transformed your exile into opportunity, how you prevented the war, your reforms, it's inspired so many of us back home. How did you do it? Charles considered the question carefully. I failed, he said finally. I failed spectacularly. I was arrogant and disrespectful, and I paid the price for it. But then I learned. I listened. I admitted my mistakes while holding on to my principles. And I was given a second chance by someone wise enough to forgive while still holding me accountable. He looked up at the crystalline throne, where Varen conferred with her counselors. That's the real lesson. Not that I was some hero, but that growth comes from acknowledging our failures and doing better. 2 years after his banishment, Charles stood once again before the crystalline throne. But this time, he came to say goodbye. Earth is requesting my return, he explained to Varen. They want me to help establish a formal alliance framework between humanity and the Viridian Empire. It will mean leaving my position as arbiter. Varen was silent for a moment, her crest shifting through colors that Charles had learned to read: consideration, respect, perhaps even sadness. You have served well, she said finally. When you return to Earth, you will go with my blessing and my gratitude. You helped prevent a war, reformed our treatment of the colonies, and built bridges between species that had never known cooperation. I had help. Yissa, the other counselors who supported reform. Accept the compliment, Charles, Varen said with what might have been amusement. You've learned humility. Don't overcorrect. Charles smiled. Thank you, Your Majesty. For everything. For the second chance most of all. You earned that chance by returning when you could have fled to safety. That took courage. Varen extended her manipulator arm, and Charles clasped it in the human handshake gesture she'd learned. "Will you return to visit?" she asked. "Often. Earth and the Empire will be partners now. I'll make sure of it." As Charles departed Throne Above Worlds for the last time as Imperial Arbiter, he reflected on his journey. He'd arrived as an exile in disgrace. He was leaving as a bridge between worlds. The view from his departing ship showed the capital in all its glory, towers of crystal reaching toward the stars, ships moving in careful harmony, countless species working together. It wasn't perfect. Challenges remained. But it was better than it had been. And Charles had learned the most important lesson of all, that serving something greater than yourself meant accepting failure, learning from it, and never giving up on the possibility of doing better. He'd been banished and had returned leading enemies. But in the end, those enemies became allies, and the exile became the bridge between worlds. The stars ahead gleamed with possibility, and Charles flew toward them with hope in his heart.